For a while now, people have been stopping me in the street. They say, "You've let the fame go to your head. Ever since you broke 20,000 subs, you've completely sold out. Making video essays and political content, you need to go back to how you started." So, I thought I'd go back to how this series started, by playing some of the worst games I could find, and boy, I have picked some real trash, so please enjoy this video because of the suffering it took to bring it into reality. Most of the time, I really enjoy making this series. I do. I have to take some breaks here and there because, honestly, sometimes the lack of variety between gray-brown shooters can get overwhelming and tiring, but by and large, I have a lot of fun revisiting old favorites, discovering classics for the first time, and even trudging through the occasional bad game for a laugh. I can say with 100% certainty, however, that I didn't enjoy a single moment of my time with America's Army. First off, from the era that turned Call of Duty into one of the biggest franchises on the planet, you'd think a game actually licensed by the US military would try and emulate the big blockbusters, to learn from what those games do to at least make a passable, if notably lacking, doppelganger. But no, it doesn't. Yeah, this is a propaganda game by the military-industrial complex, made to be a recruitment tool that looked at the exciting propaganda of Call of Duty and said, "Nah, no thank you. You won't be fighting terrorists at home or abroad. There's no Russian conspiracies.
Remember, no Russian.
No unnamed Middle Eastern countries, not even so much as a whiff of South American gun runners and cartels. Nada. Because in America's Army, you don't do cool stuff. In America's Army, you play paintball in a field and pretend you're doing cool stuff." Reading that sentence back, it's more apparent in hindsight what a self-own this entire game is. You make a game as a recruitment tool aimed at young men as an enticement to join the military in the waning years of public approval of war in the Middle East. You call it America's Army, and what does America's Army do? America's Army sucks. It blows chunks. I debated even reviewing this game, partly because it's such an incredible trial to play, which believe me I will get to, but also because it doesn't have a campaign so much as a series of bot matches tied together with duct tape. You go through war games, which train you for the various roles you can take in the online matches. There are a few ideas here, to be honest. There's an honor system that awards you for brave actions and penalizes you for not sticking with your squad, accidentally firing on allies, or other military whoopsie-doodles that get quietly swept under the rug as you continue to have a successful career. But the honor system is all this game has, something that quickly becomes apparent. Let's start like the military starts spreading their propaganda to kids, at birth. As soon as your digital avatar spawns into the world, you're endowed with all the grace of a newborn deer with no legs. See, America's Army aims for realism. Unfortunately, the Army's aim sucks, meaning we're not getting any of the smooth aiming, quick movement, tight controls, and rapid-fire action movie gameplay of Call of Duty or Halo. The movement is somehow incredibly jerky, thanks to jittery animations that glitch constantly as your shoulders and arms haphazardly slide across the screen in a vague semblance of reload animations. At the same time, the movement is also sluggish and slow, forcing you to trudge from objective to objective with the speed of an arthritic turtle paid for by the military-industrial complex. Okay, but being an authentic military simulation, the gunplay must be good, right? Fuck no! Not only does the muzzle flash commonly mismatch the firing, but the gun sounds themselves have the quality of a cell phone ringtone notification sound library. But oh boy is there feedback. The game wants to emphasize the strategic value of crouching and going prone in aiming and firing, so even if you aren't taking those positions, your accuracy is drastically reduced. Even at close range, hip firing is all but useless, but even crouching and standing still, hitting moderately ranged targets is an absolute chore that can see you emptying entire clips and missing because each shot recoils so much it throws your entire aim off. So then you have to adjust your aim, and good luck, because looking around is just as turgid as the movement, falling somewhere in a mystical hell zone between too sensitive and never responsive enough. Oh, and don't think there's any fancy auto-aim or snap to target that will help you here, because there's not. So what about the missions? The level variety? Well, there's no story or characters to follow, so you're just going through these training exercises in various locales that allow the team to reuse multiplayer assets and claim the game has some kind of single-player component. So expect the most bargain basement generic settings you'll find this side of a Steam asset flip. And I mean that as an indication of graphical quality as well as visual variety. The game came out in 2007, but so did BioShock and Modern Warfare. While this game obviously didn't have the talent or money behind it that those did, it doesn't justify the environments and many textures being pulled straight from the original Xbox. The character models don't look terrible, but the bland lighting and shoddy animation, not to mention the AI, don't make the best impression. Oh yeah, let's talk AI, because the enemy AI will oscillate, much like your friendly squad mates, between Punisher-accurate killing machines and helpless toddlers scrambling for cover like they're in a water balloon fight. The friendly AI only pays attention to teamwork when you need reviving, which, due to flimsy health and the aforementioned deadly enemy AI, will often lead to their own deaths as they heroically rush to save you, ignoring the groups of enemies that have coagulated nearby to mow them down in a hail of concentrated paintball fire. Meanwhile, the enemy AI will often have pinpoint aim from a distance that you can't hope to compete with what your army training and dogshit aim, unless you get lucky enough to have one of them get stuck on a random piece of geometry that will force them to stop and look into the middle distance like a dog forced to do advanced trigonometry. And here's the real kicker. When all of these come together, they make for a frustrating experience moment to moment, as enemies often overwhelm you and you're stuck scrambling for cover as your honor ticks down because your squad has abandoned you and moved ahead, but didn't help take care of the enemies that will kill you if you try and join them. So, what happens if you die? Just a checkpoint, right? I mean, these missions are timed for 30 minutes apiece. The game wouldn't just make you start at the beginning again, right? No. If you die, which you will, because even on the easiest difficulty, enemies can snipe you and your allies will fail you, you start at the beginning of these terrible missions. Sometimes it will be due to confusing objectives, like the very first mission, which tasks you with picking up a rocket launcher, but never specifies that you need to resupply before you pick it up, leaving you dead in the sights of a tank that will shell you. And you need to do 20 minutes of slow gameplay over again until you have memorized the exact right steps you can take to cheese the enemy AI, but also not rely on your squad at all and brute force your way to the next mission. And each subsequent playthrough reveals just how poorly designed the game is, as you play a roulette with the enemies that will appear to be too stupid in one playthrough, only to end you from afar in the next. Or your aiming, which seems to be reliable in one playthrough, but can't seem to find the broadside of a barn upon your next tours of duty in these poorly lit polygonal nightmares. And your reward? 15 achievement points for every 2 missions, regardless of difficulty. And that's it. Moment to moment, other games might be worse, but America's Army as a cohesive whole is a more frustrating grading experience. I've spoken before about the magic in good games when all the elements come together, from shooting to art design to gameplay gimmicks. A cohesive zone a game can get into, something a lot of the greatest games of all time tap into. America's Army True Soldiers is the exact opposite of that. Every aspect of it blends together, but instead of fun, those elements conspire against the player to make sure every moment is tedious, annoying, frustrating, or a mixture of the three. America's Army is a befuddling game. On the surface, it should just be a slow, unspectacular, and mediocre shooter. But every aspect of the game's design is so spectacularly fucked that it takes something that should have been an easy 5 out of 10 and drags it ass first into the deepest pits of video game hell. I hadn't even talked about how the ally AI will just wander into your shooting field, costing you 80 honor points each time, or how the radial menus are so finicky you'll be fumbling between night vision goggles and grenades in life or death firefights. But I don't need to talk about those, because if you have any sanity left in you by this point, you should know better than to touch America's Army True Soldiers. I have no idea how the multiplayer was. I've never played it, but understand previous entries had a dedicated player base, as military sims like this and Rainbow Six had back in the day. But taken on its merits as a single-player piece of content, and as a shooter, there's nothing to recommend about America's Army. Every second of gameplay felt like an excruciating cry of pain from my Xbox 360, begging me to play Modern Warfare 2 like begging for a drop of water in hell. I honestly didn't think much could beat Hour of Victory, but you know what? In that game, at least you fought Nazis. It remains one of the worst games I've ever played on every level, but America's Army's utter failure to do anything worthwhile, let alone craft a competent gameplay experience moment to moment, puts it behind even the low bar set by Hour of Victory. There's no reason to play this. Ever. At all. The paltry single-player achievements aren't even worth the effort and frustration and ensuing hours of trial and error to surmount these poorly crafted missions. There's no gunplay or big moments or unique environments to enjoy that you can't get better with Battlefield or COD, or hell, even Medal of Honor. I don't know when, or even if, my frustration at the sheer ineptitude of this piece of limp propaganda will ever be beaten, but for my own health, I pray that day never comes. Fuck this game. I fully expected Civil War: A Nation Divided to be one of the worst games I would play for this series. A Civil War-themed FPS game bearing the History Channel license of all things, with an undoubtedly shoestring budget released in 2006 where you play as Confederates and Union soldiers. What could go wrong? Everything could go wrong. But to my surprise, only some of it does. Yeah, this Civil War game isn't actually terrible. It's no surprise that, hailing from Bobby Kotick's big wet birthing sack, this game takes a lot of inspiration from Call of Duty, but this is pre-modern warfare Call of Duty, which means you don't get recurring characters and cinematic moments, you get loosely strung together battles with instanced protagonists, varied objectives, and commanding officers and random soldiers barking orders at you as you shoot things. Everything about the game is reminiscent of the early Infinity Ward and Treyarch Call of Duty games, from the sparse fields and marshes of the South standing in for European farm villages to the reliance on plodding, rifle-based shooting. Which brings me to the big fascination I had starting this game. How do you take a war fought with guns that took a minute to reload and try and make an action-packed shooter? Well, very slowly it turns out. The guns in this game have a surprising amount of variety, ranging from several revolvers to repeaters and sniper rifles, and even a few moments where you help cannons or Gatling guns. The feedback is really solid, with hefty vibrations that change in the controller depending on the gun, and some nice crunchy sound effects that can only imagine were courtesy of the History Channel's license. The aiming itself is fine, and movement can feel sluggish, there's no sprinting or going prone, but aided by a slightly too tight auto-aim, you can get a pretty good rhythm going with the gunplay. Well, if you're using the right weapons, that is. See, some rifles will down an enemy in one hit like a sniper rifle, fair enough, right? But some one-shot weapons will take 2 to 3 hits, meaning you need several seconds to reload each time. Depending on the difficulty you choose, this can be incredibly frustrating or intense in equal measure. At first I thought it was just bad, but as I came to grips with the game's flow and the shooting, I saw more novelty in the approach. There's also an assortment of bladed weapons and bayonets for close quarters fighting, all of which is incredibly bloodless and accompanied by some of the worst sudden screen-shaking motion blur that just descends into a mosh pit of gameplay. Of course, 6-shot revolvers and 12-shot repeaters may do slightly less damage, but are overall preferable because of the insta-kill if you land a headshot. With the gameplay out of the way, the mention of headshots brings me to the game's presentation. In keeping with Call of Duty, Civil War is a T-rated game. You'll get some blood, but that's about it. This is a very sterile version of the bloodiest war in America's history, except for when it shows you actual dead bodies during the pre- and post-mission History Channel episodes, which is just very funny to me that there's just full History Channel logo here on display. It's like someone sat on the remote and changed the channel mid-game. I'll give the game some slack in presentation, being a budget shooter from 2006. It does its best to hang as a passable facsimile of COD and other World War II shooters. The graphics ain't half bad, with one foot in the Xbox era. There's some nice coloration, some really great photorealistic skyboxes, and even crisp reflections and puddles. While of course it's primarily linear, it does a nice job alternating between open areas, tight forest paths, winding trenches and farms and encampments. Across the game's incredibly brief 3-ish hour runtime, the 12 missions take you to a decent level variety across famous southern battlefields, with visual variety bolstered by different times of day. Annoyingly, there's only one mission that takes place in a city, which is the final climactic battle. It's a fine level, but the variety feels like it could have been nice to spread through the rest of the game, as there are maybe one too many swamps and fields. But again, an impressive effort for what's obviously running on some tight restrictions. But then the limitations show through in so many other ways. Missions may have one of 3 similar soldiers talking to you and giving you orders, but more often than not, they end unceremoniously, fading to black and stats screens showing mid-ambush or battle. Several times I thought I had somehow strayed and gotten a game over, when no, I done good, the game just ran out of game to show me. I mentioned the reused soldiers, and that's a trend throughout. There are probably enough voice actors to count on one hand comprising both sides of this war. I mean, I know this was brother against brother, but this is ridiculous. What little exposition there is, perhaps fittingly, feels like it's voiced by the average modern Civil War reenactor, someone who may have a passion for the role, but their day job as a dentist or whatever does not lend them the dramatic talent to pull it off. This dearth of voice lines is most glaring, however, in the death and damage sounds, which there are maybe 4 or 5 I think get recycled most, but then also some guttural hell screams sometimes. But mostly you hear the same damage VO for when you as a player take damage as when you deal damage to enemies, turning some high-intensity scenes into a cacophony of hearing the same lines multiple times, which, if you aren't annoyed by it, can be very funny. What's not so fun is playing as the Confederacy, those rapscallions. I was worried this game would valorize the Southern dipshits, or even worse, completely fail to depict meaningful differences between them and the Union. But to my surprise, while subtle, the game absolutely shits on the racist rednecks at every turn, even when you're playing as them. During the Confederate missions, you're often given the worst, most half-cocked and desperate plans, most of which fail due to sheer incompetency. Even the commanders and soldiers that get speaking parts seem like Deliverance rejects, and the final mission culminates with the Union taking Petersburg and flying the colors. Now, this might sound like a pretty sweet game overall, but temper your expectations because, despite a thin runtime, this game can still feel like a slog at times. There's next to no meaningful enemy variety. Enemies rush at you in droves, and due to a lack of respawning or healing allies, many assaults can end with you fighting all alone against enemy forces. It's never unmanageable, mostly because the enemy AI is... well, look, if this is how the Confederacy fought, I'm not surprised they lost the war. So, the AI is mindless, the game is short, but still incredibly repetitive, and there's lacking environmental variety. But, as a Civil War-focused shooter, the gunplay is interesting and unique, even if it can't hold interest over time. The environmental variety that's there can be fun, and overall the thin presentation makes for a fun retro spin on a shooter formula that was wearing thin even in 2006. To my surprise, you can do a lot worse than Civil War and Nation Divided. Not the most ringing endorsement, but then again, it's not the worst game ever. Or the best. It's just kind of there. Damnation is the kind of game that Game Magazine reviewers would be edging themselves for hours playing the game before finally climaxing as they sat down to write their review and could finally release their magnum opus pun for the headline of their review, Gears of Bore. It's frankly shocking how much Damnation wants to be Gears of War, yet still does so much to not actually learn from Epic's seminal third-person shooter. Even the menus are strikingly similar to Gears 1. We have another Unreal Engine 3 shooter with a gritty militaristic premise, co-op, loose squad mechanics like revival and cover, and probably most similar, the gratingly gray color palette. The color palette actually goes hand in hand with Damnation's biggest problem, a side effect of Unreal Engine 3, the blur and bloom. See, one of Damnation's few selling points is its use of large environments, and to be fair, the game does manage to craft some impressively big environments to traverse, and despite the occasional mid-level loading screen, also runs at a fairly consistent frame rate, so props to the engineering team for pulling off that feat. The problem with the game's scale is that it's really in service of nothing but spectacle, a spectacle that is rendered positively inert by poor visual quality. Damnation is the rare game where visually nothing works as intended. Outdoor scenes have the bloom cranked to 11 at times, and even without the effect, there's plenty of distance blur, an effort I imagine to compensate for the large levels. The desaturated colors also drag the game's art style back, blurring everything into a shifting gray-brown sludge. This includes enemy visibility, as the generic soldiers can be hard to pick out of the busy, blurry backgrounds at the best of times, and I often confuse them for my own allies at medium distance. Something interesting to note, and what I can only imagine is a visual glitch, is that when you're using the second sight ability you get to look and see where enemies might be hiding in cover, as soon as it switches back, you can actually see a desaturated version of the world for a brief second. I don't know if this is because this is how the game looked before they decided to model it more after Gears in the visuals department, but either way, it looks way better than the game we got. However, all of these issues directly affect gameplay. Damnation, like Gears, gives heavy damage penalties to make sure players are using cover. The problem is that the environments are huge, and most weapons, like the ever-present assault rifle, are not made with the vast distances in mind, so the average firefight goes something like this. You see an enemy, they begin firing at you with the other enemies. You try to return fire, but you have to take cover before any bullets hit, and you have to wait because Damnation has one of the worst damage effect screens I've ever seen, turning the already gray game black and white and worsening bloom and blur as you panic and try to find a shape vaguely resembling cover. Once healed, you peek from cover, empty an entire clip because your assault rifle has the spread of an average shotgun. If you're lucky, maybe you almost kill your target, and then rinse and repeat. The guns, as mentioned, offer nothing interesting or special. You mostly use the same assault rifle and occasionally a sniper rifle with sparse ammo. There are a few pistols and a shotgun that's basically useless unless you're almost touching the enemy. Speaking of touching, there is melee combat, but the game has no soft lock-on and no instant kill animations, meaning you're treated to the dummy do-si-do as you and your AI partner two-step in the opposite directions as the game's slippery control sidefuck the game's shitty AI tracking until somebody dies. The one standout weapon I will mention is a heated rail spike gun that is a one-shot kill for most enemies and is pretty satisfying to use, but ammo being in sparse supply, you don't actually get that satisfying of a time using it. So we've got lackluster gameplay and poor graphics, but what about the world and story? You'll be positively shocked to know it's terrible. Damnation mashes several subgenres and styles together in what I can only assume is an effort to stumble into something compelling, but the end result is a mangled mess of militarism, post-Civil War alt history, steampunk innovations, and then several staples of the cyberpunk genre like genetic modification, corporate warfare, and human augmentation. Throw in some bizarre indigenous-style magic and a cast of women who all seem to think Blood Rain's outfit was too subtle, and you've basically got the idea. You are generic McWhiteman, whose face I'm pretty sure was just reused for Matt Hazard. You have a dark past that isn't really the focus because the game can't decide if it wants to spend the precious few moments it has of cutscenes focusing on the main character, the villains and their motivations, world building, or the assemblage of cardboard cutouts that make up your allies. The game makes poor use of its own premise. This is a world with magic where the coolest powers you get are the ability to see enemies through walls, an ability made useless, by the way, by how long it takes to activate. It's a world with steampunk weaponry where you use the same assault rifle for a majority of game time. A world with robots and superpower serums that pits you against the same brain-dead generic soldier goons for most of it. A game with vehicle sections on wall-riding motorcycles, which is initially cool, but these sections devolve into bland, overlong driving segments that do nothing to challenge the player or meaningfully switch up the formula. You just drive in a straight line, get out, shoot fools, and either climb something or drive somewhere else. That's the whole game. Damnation isn't one of those games that I can acknowledge the flaws of, but has something unique to make up for it. It's not like Shellshock 2 or Legendary, where there are small hints of greatness that make it interesting enough to check out, even as a curiosity. If you watch this footage, you've seen all it has to offer in all its muddled gray glory. I've never been the biggest fan of steampunk stuff to begin with, but even what's here I can't imagine would be cool looking enough for most fervent fans of the subgenre to be tempted by. However, there is one thing it has worth mentioning, as it works fairly well: a parkour system. As much as this game lives in the shadow of Gears of War, Damnation has one thing Gears doesn't: a jump button. At first I was dreading how the game with its poor hit detection would handle a navigation system with wall jumping, hanging, and clambering. To my surprise, it's the most polished aspect of the experience and is honestly more engaging with its climbing mechanics than even most AAA games now. Not high praise in a world where climbing is usually just holding forward, but it's something. The climbing, along with the open-air verticality of most levels, should reasonably lead to a gameplay balance where you can just spider-monkey your way around the levels, flanking and getting a drop on enemies. But all the aforementioned issues with enemy and weapon balance make what could have been an interesting spin on the combat little more than the primary method of mixing up gameplay variety. Each navigation section plays out as a little puzzle for you to find what to climb next to progress, and mercifully, there are often multiple solutions, so you'll never be stuck for long before the next shootout. But that's really all Damnation has to offer: climbing and lackluster shootouts. I don't think I've seen such a fantastical premise with so few ideas to bring to the table like this in a while. It's not hard enough to be frustrating like some of the worst games I've played here, and runs surprisingly competently, so it's not the absolute bottom of the barrel. But it is bloated and tedious for every second of its runtime. Even for fans of the genre, I can't recommend Damnation. Just leave it in the past like the bad alt history story it is. Hello there everybody, and thank you for watching this video. I know a lot of people out there have been wondering when I'm going to start making gaming videos again, so I hope you enjoyed this one as I return to the shooter ranking series, and if you haven't watched the other videos in this series, please go catch up, even though the first ones are a little bit rough as I was dealing with some issues trying to get audio recording where I wanted it to be. It's still one of my favorite series to do, and I'm so glad more and more people are getting to enjoy them now. If you'd like to be listed along with the wonderful miracle workers here as a Patreon producer, please head over to my Patreon and check it out. For just $1 a month, you can get your name listed here, help me pay rent, pay bills, and turn this content creation thing into a full-time endeavor, which I am getting closer to doing every day. That means more content for you guys and other fun things as a patron as well, like cosplay photo sets and sneak peeks at my writing. Also, if you didn't know, I am now streaming, or at least trying to, over on twitch.tv/dead domain. I'll be streaming 7 p.m. PST on Thursdays and Saturdays moving forward, at least for the time being, so be sure to check me out there. And finally, if you enjoyed this video, please do give it a thumbs up, engage in the comments down below, share it on Reddit, do whatever you gotta do to appease the algorithm gods, because, like I said, every little bit helps right now. And finally, I do want to send a heartfelt thanks to all my patrons and everybody who has donated and helped me and supported me, even though I've been doing a lot more political content lately, supported me so that I can continue making silly, weird, dumb little videos like this. Thank you so much, thank you for watching, and I hope you have a wonderful day.